Welcome everyone again. This is the last talk from our encounter of today. I'll give you Professor Roberto of Meister Pich. He's a well-known Brazilian scholar with a PhD made in Bonn. Besides, he's ambassador or was named ambassador of Bonn University. Isn't it true, Roberto? During 2019 to 2021. Well, he's a very well-known researcher in medieval philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of religion. It is a huge, on Scotus, for instance, an author that is unreadable without the contribution of Pich together. But he's now with us today because he belongs and he directs a project known as Scholastica Colonialis, which aims at rewriting the history of philosophy, Latin American philosophy. So we are going to make a trip from China to Chile and Ecuador. Thank you, Robert Pich.
Thank you so much, Mario, for this beautiful introductory words. And of course, many, many thanks, Nicola, for this invitation. I'm happy to be part of this beautiful project you have conceived. Thank you for the opportunity. Let's begin. Just a second. Yeah. I will just use this a couple of slides. I will basically read my paper and use some slides to illustrate some important passages. As it has been demonstrated by the North American scholar educated at the University of Texas, Walter Redmond, who produced a remarkable inventory of colonial philosophical works titled Bibliography of the Philosophy in the Iberian Colonies of America, published in 1972. Theoretical philosophy in Latin American higher education institutions basically adopted the cursus philosophicus of logic, natural philosophy, and metaphysics imported from Salamanca and Alcalá. Quite unsurprisingly, the works of Aristotle served as the basis of the cursus philosophici produced in Iberian and in Latin American institutions. Deterministic and Aristotelian logic were continuously studied. In the teaching of metaphysics, most of the masters were, of course, influenced by Aristotle's metaphysics, but they were above all in search of a systematic presentation that will be loyal to the leading intellectual minds of their own traditions, such as Aquinas for the Dominicans and then Scotus for the Franciscans. The major part of Redmond's studies on Latin American scholasticism is dedicated to the formal logic discernible in the sumuli, as well as to the philosophy of logic lato sensu, discernible in the greater logic, or commentaries based on Aristotle's organon. This remark is to stress the point that in the area of logic, important research with significant results has been done about works and authors active in the Viceroyalty of Peru and in Mexico, where the Spaniards early on in May and in September 1551, respectively, created a university system modeled after those at the universities of Salamanca and Alcalá. It is probably true that the Augustinian friar Alonso de Veracruz was the first person to teach philosophy in the New World, first in local convents, and from 1553 onwards at the Royal Pontifical University of Mexico, today Universidad Nacional Autónoma. Veracruz had studied grammar and rhetoric in Alcalá and completed his theological education in Salamanca, where Vitoria and Soto were among his teachers. In 1554, Veracruz wrote the first work on philosophy in the Americas, a logical textbook in 2 volumes, Recognitio Sumularum in Dialectica Resolutio, And in 1557, he composed a work on natural philosophy, the Physica Speculatio. In private communications to me, Walter Redmond confirmed my own judgment regarding current research on the philosophy of nature in Latin American colonial scholasticism. There are many texts, but they are the least studied of the cursus philosophicus. He added that the famous Jesuit Antonio Rubio might be taken as a good example of this unfortunate lack of research. After all, Antonio Rubio's Lógica Mexicana had a total of 18 editions, but of the 55 editions of his philosophical works, 2/3 were on the philosophy of nature, namely commentaries on the physics, on the soul, on generation and corruption, as well as on the heavens. If there are not many analytical studies on the philosophy of nature in Latin American colonial scholasticism, there are some studies that richly describe historical sources in different parts of Latin America and provide insightful overviews on the teaching of Physicalia during the colonial period. The main researcher is the Argentinian scholar Celina Ana Lectora Mendoza, who published several works on the history of natural sciences in colonial Argentina, or rather the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, and especially in colonial Colombia, or rather the Viceroyalty of Nueva Granada. What Lectora Mendoza understands as the European 17th century model of exposition and debate of topics in philosophy of nature, with a few exceptions, remains as the Latin American model until the end of the colonial period. 16th, 17th century European expositions of the physical works usually follow the order of the Aristotelian books, always beginning with the 8 books of the physics and focused on themes which had metaphysical and theological implications. To a certain extent, from the middle of the 17th century on, teaching of physics began to change, being then divided into 2 parts. A first part on Aristotelian physics and quite intra-scholastic in character, a second part about all other themes of Aristotelian physics, where experimental aspects began more and more to play a significant role. However, by comparing Jesuit authors active in New Granada from 1647 to 1761, Lectora Mendoza concludes that, as an emphasis, expositions of physics had a disputing character on quite internal scholastic issues, which were seen then as special reasons for disagreements, both inside and among the orders. Under this, so to say, quite anachronistic intellectual mindset, Lectora Mendoza emphasizes 4 topics which were predominant in academic physics from the late 16 to 1800 in colonial scholasticism. First, there is the debate on prime matter. For Aristotle, matter as such is one of the intrinsic core principles which, together with form, constitute natural being. As we know, it is the potential principle of any physical compositor. Aristotle saw it as such as pure potency, but medieval thinkers and also Suarez interpreted Aristotle's terminology in different ways. They disputed, for example, whether prime matter had some reality of its own. For Aquinas, prime matter is only real in the composite, that is, in virtue of a formal principle that makes anything to be what it is. Matter, thus, is not a being, it is a principle of being. But Scotus and Suarez, and after Suarez, several Jesuits, seem to give prime matter a principle of its own. Jesuits actually entered into the dispute having in mind one strong thesis of Suarez metaphysics, namely that the essence of matter is not really distinct from its existence. I will say more about this later in the paper. As a second topic, Lectora Mendoza highlights the discussion on the multiplicity of subordinate forms. For Aristotle, the substantial composite has only one form. But some medieval authors, also for theological reasons, proposed the so-called forma corporitatis of the living beings, in order to explain, for example, the identity of a dead body, that is, a body without a soul as animating principle. That structural form should be subordinated to the specific form of the living being, a plant, an animal, a human being, etc. And it had the role of universally assuring corporeal homogeneity from a formal point of view. As a third central topic, we have the multiplicity of non-subordinate forms. Thomists, following Aristotle, consider impossible the coexistence of two forms of different species in the same being. A being cannot be at the same time, say, a dog and a cat. For Aquinas, not even God in its omnipotence could produce a being that will be at the same time cat and dog, not because it would be a defect of its omnipotence, but because it was about an impossible thing. The Thomists generally work here with the principle that an objective impossibility not only was an absolute limit of factibility, but also of cognoscibility. In such a non-empirical controversy, however, Jesuits and Franciscans used to demand more rigorous conditions for metaphysical impossibility, where a metaphysical possibility was always open to a logically absolute power of divinely and immediately effecting something, that is, an absolute possible. Against the Thomists, Franciscans and Jesuits argued that the coexistence of forms of different species was an absolute possible. Finally, as a fourth topic, the relationship between uncreated cause and created causes is highlighted. Of course, the theory of causality is central in Aristotle's physics as a theory of motion or change. But now, Baroque scholastic thinkers, and up to the end of the 18th century, our Latin American masters, discussed the kinds of relationship between God as uncreated efficient cause and created efficient causes in the physical world. Four themes were central, namely divine concourse, physical premonition, concourse for evil or sin, and relationship between divine concourse and free causality. For the sake of brevity, I do not make any comments on these four themes here. Lectora Mendoza offers a negative evaluation of these anachronistic intra-scholastic tendencies in approaching philosophy of nature in the colonial period. After all, they block the reception and emergence of modern physics, of Newton's mechanics in the New World, and were not even a true Aristotelian development of natural sciences. How to properly judge about Lectora Mendoza's account of the development of philosophy of nature in Latin American colonial period? In order to provide a basis for an answer, as well as to have a representative overview of philosophy of nature in colonial Latin America as a whole, my current project is to work primarily on colonial manuscripts commenting on Aristotle's Libri Physicorum that were produced in different places of the continent at a fairly early stage, 17th century, and by intellectuals pertaining to different religious orders. This brings us to the courses on philosophy of nature given by Ignatius Gil Castelví, Ecuador, and by Juan de Fuica, Chile, two magistri that wrote a complete cursus philosophicus. Regarding their rather metaphysical approach to nature, late 18th century works on natural philosophy should provide perhaps a contrasting view, especially with regard to the role of experience in giving theses about nature and evidential support. This brings us to some remarks on the cursus by Juan Bautista Aguirre in Quito, again in Ecuador. Let's say something about this masters. Ecuador has a quite significant amount of old imprints and philosophical manuscripts from the colonial period. The most important materials are the holdings that belong to the library of the Universidad de San Gregorio, founded under Jesuit administration in September 1622. Hundreds of manuscripts by Jesuit masters have survived. Let's talk of one 17th century Jesuit master of arts, Ignatius G. Castelvi, whose single surviving manuscript comprises a complete cursus philosophicus, Dialectica in libros Aristoteles Physicorum, Tractatus in metaphysicam de ente, Tractatus in 3 libros Aristoteles de anima, Disputationes in 2 libros Aristoteles de orto et interito, sive degeneratione et corruptione. As it seems, Castelvi dictated his course on physics in the second half of 1665. According to what I could investigate, Castelvi's exposition on the physics confirms very much the 17th century model, focused on intra-scholastic problems, as well as on metaphysical and theological considerations, sketched by Lectora Mendoza. The adequate object of physics is natural body or natural being. Complete substantial body is the object of attribution of physics, for everything that is treated in physics can be reduced to such an object. Let me say something about the principles of natural being and about nature, motion, and causes. These are fundamental topics in their expositions of books 1 and 2 of the physics. To begin with, Castelvi first explains the principles of natural being in facto esse, or in its actual composition of essential parts. These are the intrinsic parts that compose and explain a complete natural body. He is interested in showing that the principles here must be irreducible. They compose something and are not again composed by anything. All agree that matter and form are intrinsic principles of the actual composition. Castelvi wants to explain that union is a further third principle of natural being in facto esse. Union is a principle ut quo, while matter and form are a principle ut quod. A whole needs a principle ut quo in order to be constituted. Union is the action, the essential cause through which matter and form compose and subsist. He makes efforts to show that neither subsistence nor privation of a given form are intrinsic parts of a given natural being. Second, Castelvi traditionally explains the principles of natural being in theory, that is, regarding the process of becoming what it is as a result of a kind of change. The natural being in theory can be taken either as generation, change, or conversion. Principles of natural being in facto esse and in theory do not coincide, and they are also not principles of each other. For metaphysical reasons, Castelvi carefully distinguishes generation from change. Above all, generation does not necessarily presuppose as a principle privation of any pre-existing form in the substrate that suffers generation. After all, generation can exist eternally. If privation of form actually precedes a new generation, this is something contingent, not essential to generation. Generation could have been done at the very first logical instant in which matter exists, and at that instant, the privation of forms would not have been separated as a principle. Castelvi speaks of active generation as a very specific kind of change. Its term is generation itself. It is just a passage from not being generation to being generation. There is also passive generation, whose term is a generated item. It is the passage from not being form to being form in a given substrate. Passive generation or passive change is constituted both by privation of form and form itself in the substrate as principles. Similarly, conversion can be viewed as a subkind of passive generation or change, since it is not precisely a change, but rather the passage of being one form to being another form in a given substrate. Conversion is intrinsically constituted both by privation of one given form and another received form in the substrate as principles. In difference to an Aristotelian view on physics, given that the analysis of natural being in theory considers a kind of active generation that should cover Trinitarian purposes with regard to the way Christ was generated, but not created by the Father. Castelvi says that privation of form is not a necessary principle of natural being in the process of becoming. Unsurprisingly, the focus of the analysis of natural being is the natural being in theory or regarding change. This is the focus of Physics Book 2, that is, an account both of nature and of causes in order to explain change. Nature, in Aristotle's definition, is about any principle and cause of motion and rest, both per se or essential and accidental principles of motion and rest. Castelvi initially defines nature simply as the principle of substantial composite in facto esse. He has, of course, to offer a further analysis of natural being in theory, and for that purpose, he will need to explain motion, or rather natural motion, which opposes both to free, supernatural, and violent. Natural philosophy is concerned with motions that are according to created forces. But Castelvi first describes conceptual problems regarding violent motion, which is defined by Aristotle as an external principle that opposes to the recipient substrate. The substrate that suffers that motion had an inclination to the opposite, as for example, an upward movement is opposed to the inclination of what is heavy. Truly, prime matter, or matter barely taken, never receives through violence successive forms. They are all connatural to it. Once matter is disposed, however, by one form, other forms can oppose to the intrinsic expectation of that form up to the point of being violent to it. So does God when he introduces a given form into a stone so that the stone floats in the air. The form introduced is not violent to the agent. It is just a violent motion contrary to the inclination of a natural being. Castelvi assumes, moreover, that a substrate disposed by a given form is able to receive a plurality of non-subordinate forms, even against the intrinsic disposition of the previous remaining form. If we remember, however, how important it was for Castelvi to find intrinsic principles of natural being in theory in terms of generation, change, and conversion, he now connects to those processes that bring about the composite being the more specific notion of cause or physical cause, whose general definition must be discussed. Whose general definition, must be discussed. A first definition given by Thomistic authors is this: cause is that from which the being of another follows, or that from whose being another being follows. This is a bad definition, since it is not the case that from there being privation of a form, another form has to follow. It is not the case that being put together both sides of a contradiction, the position of an effect has to follow. A second definition is this one. Cause is that on which something depends as some essential influential thing. But this definition sounds confusing for the theologian. The divine Son depends on the divine Father as on some essential influential thing. For to depend is to receive being from another and not being able to be without what one receives in the relation to the other. But the divine Father is not the cause of the divine Son. Thus, the definition just given cannot be true. Castelvi only accepts a general definition of cause in terms of principle, quoting, a principle that unconditionally gives being to the effect. In his explanation, he emphasizes that he uses principle as a general term that should cover or include principles, which are not causes. Eternal Father is the principle of persons that proceed in divine Trinity, but he's not their cause. All other particles in the definition just help distinguishing cause as principle in philosophy of nature from divine Father as productive principle in the Trinity. Divine Father as productive principle does not give any being to the other person as effects. And to simpliciter give being to an effect is what a cause, properly speaking, a natural physical cause does. Not, however, an improper cause. It is under this precise definition that Castelvi accepts to talk of further divisions of physical cause, such as essential and accidental cause. An essential physical cause is the one that really and truly exerts influence through physical influx on the effect, such as fire brings heat as an effect. Castelvi further divides physical cause into material, formal, efficient, and final, all of them to be found, for example, in human being, prime matter, rational soul, generating man, and God, because of whom human being was made. There are, moreover, first and second causes, God and creatures. There are univocal and equivocal causes, fire as the cause of fire, sun as the cause of light, or God as the cause of creatures. There are also total and partial causes. God as the cause of the angel, creature, which does nothing without the concourse of divine omnipotence. So, Castelvi's explanations in natural philosophy are dramatically conceptual. He attempts to provide an intelligible picture of natural being and world that not only coheres with metaphysical theological contents, but is also methodologically linked to those habitus. Let's focus now for a while on an Scotist course on Physicalia. Juan de Fuica, a Franciscan from Chile, was one of the few colonial scholastic thinkers who dictated a complete triennial cursus philosophicus, since most of our Latin American masters wrote a text either in logic or physics or metaphysics. Fuica clearly belongs to a tradition of Scotist thinkers connected to the convent of San Francisco de Lima, whose teachers, such as Valera and Briceño, influenced generations of Franciscan masters of arts in the many studia that the order provided in America for philosophical education. Fuica's commentary Ad Mentem Scoti on Aristotle's Eight Libri Physicorum was finished in May 1689. It was written after his commentary on metaphysical questions. In fact, Fuica's explanations of the philosophy of nature are somehow a continuation of the metaphysical project. After all, the object of metaphysics as science of transcendentals is the ens reale, not substance. And on its turn, the adequate object of physics is the complete substantial body, which belongs to the category of substance. It uses to be called metaphysical body. Everything treated in physics can be reduced to complete material body, can be reduced to complete substantial body. The formal object of physics under which knowledge of complete material body is won is cognoscibility through principles proper to physics. This formality brings substantial body down to philosophy as the science of natural things. In distinction 1 of Book 1 on the principles of natural being in common, Fuika confirms that strict principles of natural composite body are matter and form. They are intrinsic principles of natural bodies. Fuika discusses whether the principles of complete substantial body in terms of physical formal cognoscibility are 3 in number. This is important because physical things can be considered either, again, in the process of becoming, in theory, or in accomplished being, in facto esse. In line with Aristotle, he confirms that natural beings in the science of physics are formally treated according to the process of becoming. They are considered regarding modification, and for that reason, there are 3 intrinsic principles to be considered: matter, form, and privation. Privation was denied by Castelvi as an intrinsic principle. The process about which physical knowledge is concerned with is basically mutatio, which is passage from one term to another. Change presupposes action by some active principle and reception by some passive principle. Principles of natural being in the perspective of change are exactly 3: matter, form, and privation of form. Privation is not a principle of natural thing regarding accomplished being, but only regarding being in theory. In a further, quite metaphysical note, Fuika refuses to say that union is also an intrinsic principle of natural being as composite of matter and form. It is not an essential part of the composite, but rather and only a modification of the composite's parts, a sort of mode, and in the way the modus of being is distinguished from the things. This is a very peculiar modal distinction by Scotus in the 16th, 17th century. Moreover, Fuika explains that matter as a physical principle of natural body has no contrary principle. Neither form nor privation are contrary principles to matter. There is, however, a relative transcendental opposition between matter and form, insofar as one is essentially order to the other. Truly, Fuika sketches a Scotus course on the philosophy of nature and deals extensively with prime matter as a principle of natural things and of change. After all, matter is the subject of generation and corruption. And here, schools of thought in Fuika's times differ significantly. He's committed to express what should be a Scotist account of the nature of matter as principle of composite being and change. There is no doubt that there is a prime matter, because change implies a theory in a subject, and this subject is prime matter. But what is it? According to a first definition, assumed later by Neoplatonic thinkers, prime matter non est quid. It is actually and more properly nihil. But according to a second definition taken from Aristotle's Physics, Book 1, Chapter 9, prime matter is first subject of anything from which something turns to be, such that it is not accidental. End of quote. It is thus a sort of subject substrate of any change. It is a first subject-substrate because it does not presuppose any order from which its potentiality is taken. Anything changed or in process of changing is constituted by it. As a subject-substrate, it is an essential part of the bodily substance. It is better called incomplete substance, for it requires to be complemented by a given form in order to compose the substantial whole. Moreover, prime matter, I need something like 5-7 minutes, okay? I know that I have used already more than 30. Moreover, prime matter is an entity really distinct from form, which can be really separated from it. It belongs to the essence of prime matter, the radical potency to receive forms. This is what constitutes prime matter as real aspect of the world and distinguishes it from all other things. With Scotus, Foucault repeats the idea that in the very ultimate formality of the first subject of change, there is a capacity or passive potency to receive forms. He invokes Scotus and Scotists such as Merinero, Pontius, Blasco de Benjumea to defend the view that the so-called transcendental relationality or order of matter to receive forms does not say the essence of matter. It is rather a property, really identical, but formally distinguished from matter. Matter, which is an absolute entity and so has or can have independent existence, receives forms because of its essence, not because of transcendental relationality. It is no surprise that at the heart of the matter, there is a deep metaphysical dispute whether matter is pure potency to the extent that it does not include from itself any entity or entitative act of itself. Of course, Foucault has in view the opinion by Aquinas and the Thomists who affirm that prime matter is pure or absolutely passive potency, which as such has neither essential act nor entitative act. The conclusion he wants to give support to is that matter has objective potency, the potency something has which does not contradict to exist. From itself and not from form, matter has its actual essence or entitative act, as Scotus affirmed in Ordinatio 2, distinction 12. It is a fundament of Scotus' philosophy that everything that is real is positive, has thus a ratio of entitative act regarding the possible being, which is the objective potency. This is a central notion. Matter, which exists as a fact in nature, has true real being, positive being, distinct from form. It is a true entitative act regarding its possibility or objective potency. It is real objective potency. Its nature is to be objective potentiality, and this item of the world is real and thus has positive being. But how has matter a ratio actus? It has a ratio actus, what takes away the indifference of a merely possible thing. So it happens with any actual real being regarding its merely possible being. It has a determination of its own. According to a further argument, Foucault admits, of course, that prime matter was created by God, and as long as it exists in the composite, it has a real essence. Otherwise, it won't be a real thing. But the essence of matter is not intrinsically constituted through form in its being of essence, since matter is essentially objective potency. As a conclusion, it has its entity or entitative act from itself, not from form. If we should further discuss how the notion of existence applies to the debate on the ontological status of prime matter and form as principles of natural being, we are reminded by Foucault that Aquinas and all Thomists affirm that prime matter does not have any act of existence of its own, but it rather exists through the existence of a form. Again, Fujika confronts this view with what Scotto said in Orinato 2, distinction 12, question 1. And in this issue, he was followed by the family of Jesuit thinkers. If, as it has been proved before, it must be assumed that prime matter has its own entitative act or own actual entity, which is distinct from the entity of form, then it must be also assumed that matter has its own or proper existence. What is a proper essence? This is a metaphysical principle. Has or can have a proper existence. This presupposes the idea that there is no real distinction between essence and existence, at most a modal distinction. Therefore, since actual entity and existence are really the same, if matter has its own actual entity, so its own existence too. Some words to finish. If we now would have time to read the commentaries on physics by Juan Bautista Aguirre from 1756, 1769, there is a very interesting picture. Bautista Aguirre is very much interested in introducing in the study of physics and in the commentaries of Aristotle aspects of experience, even experiments and experiments by means of instruments. But one thing remains. He's very much sympathetic to the idea that in order to get evidential support to physical knowledge, we should use something like a principle of parsimony, entia non multiplicanda sunt sine necessitate, and very much fond of using something like a principle of provability. In principle, we should admit as physical evidence and information what can be demonstrated and proved, if possible, by means of instruments. But one very interesting thing remains, especially in the topics of Book 1 and Book 2, about the intrinsic principles of change and the external principles of change. Aguirre, in the end of the 18th century, truly believes that no system is better than the Aristotelian system, because the Aristotelian system is the only one that can provide, this is very important, not experimental evidential support, but intelligibility to experience of the natural world. And this is something that is being connected by me in this project of investigating the commentaries on the Libri Physicorum. This is the hypothesis. Perhaps the history of the commentaries on the Libri Physicorum will reveal that Aristotle's philosophy of nature, ad mentem scoti, ad mentem tome, by the understanding of our scholastic masters, was being more and more transformed into a discussion on the intelligibility of the physical world and our fundamental conceptual framework to understand natural world. Was being transformed more and more into a basic discussion about intelligibility of world experience, the experience of changing nature. Would this approach be something like a route to philosophy of nature as an investigation on the possibility of world experience that somehow makes a bridge between commentaries on Libri Metaphysicorum and something like critical philosophy by someone like Immanuel Kant in the 18th century? I think this is a path to be investigated in this tradition of texts, and there remain the fundamental importance not only to medieval philosophy or second scholastic philosophy, of studying the intrinsic principles of change and the intrinsic principles of being in facto esse and in fieri. I think this is an important contribution. Thank you for your attention. This is it.